I give a fuck? Why do I give a fuck? Why do I try so hard? Why do I care so much?
Welcome to Why Do I Give a Fuck? A cross-cultural conversation between myself, Diane Tate,
and Johanna Thompson. In these times of great struggle and possible shift, we ask ourselves,
why do we give a fuck about any of it? How does the lens we see the world through impact what we see?
And what do we do about it?
Man, these conversations got me thinking, got me curious about so many things, thinking about the State of the Union address that we were talking about. And one of the major things that Donald Trump did not speak about was education and the futuring of the United States. And what does that look like as we are thinking about technology, as we're thinking about like literally education in the schools, as we're thinking about whether or not to show up to the State of the Union, because are we getting the information that we need to be able to figure out how we're going to make decisions. So I know that you had a story about something happening in the schools.
Yeah, I had an experience last week. I volunteer with an organization that mentors youth, that most of the kiddos whose families have immigrated from different countries in Africa. And so English is not necessarily their first language. And I mentor three of these, three siblings, two girls and a boy. The boy is the middle child. And so they had an award. The middle and youngest child go to the same school, and they had an award ceremony last week. And they were going to be receiving some awards, and the parents weren't able to attend for work reasons. So I went, and it was my first time at the school and my first time seeing kind of the dynamics and the setup of the school, and got to watch the kiddos get their awards. But before they started giving out the awards, there was a gentleman that got up. He didn't introduce himself. I guess he just assumed everybody knew who he was. I'm guessing maybe he was the vice principal. He wasn't the principal, because I met her later. And I was just horrified at the monologue that he gave before he even started passing out awards, because it was all about, you have to be smart. You have to be smart, which to me, that use of that word right off the rip is problematic. Because if you're not smart, then that suggests you're dumb. It's like that's not the languaging that I would think would make sense if I was the one writing the speech. So it was, you got to be smart. You got to be smart. If you're not smart, you won't make any money. And if you don't make any money, you're not going to, be able to support yourself.
Well.
So
and
yeah.
These are third, fourth, and fifth graders.
Fourth, fifth, and sixth graders.
Middle school young people.
Yeah. So it's all about capitalism. It's all about money, money, money. When he went to go give out the awards for improvement in mathematics, it was all about, got to know numbers. You got to know numbers. If you don't know numbers, you're not going to be able to make any money. If you don't make any money, it was just, yeah,
really rooted in capitalism to these young minds.
I wanted to stand up and go, no, So they got their awards, which was wonderful. One of the youngest child, one of the girls got, they did first honors and second honors for the top grades. The top grades in the class got first honors, and the next tier of grades got second honors. So she got second honors, got a second honors certificate. And she also got an improvement certificate in mathematics. So that was wonderful. And then the middle child, the boy, got a certificate of improvement in reading, I believe it was. But he's,
he's celebratory. It was a nice celebratory
Yes,
event.
He was very excited to see that for them and to be there for them on that one. And then afterwards, they all went back to class, and I had been messaging, because they do everything on an app now, to be able to message the teachers. And I messaged the middle child's teacher, and just asked if she possibly had any time to just meet with me. Just really, I was looking for introductions and just start the dialogue, because he's got some challenges in certain areas, and we really wanted to try to advocate for him to get any kind of help that he might need additional to what he's receiving already.
And you had communicated this with the parents that you were going to
Yes, yeah.
We were
Already
supported.
talked to the parents about this, and yeah, and they just couldn't be there, and so they had asked if I would, start this dialogue.
Which is
And
good community building. I brought that up to say, like, when certain community members can't be at these conferences, if you have a community of support to help, it's also very productive.
yes, yeah. And there are language barriers for them. They speak Swahili and French, the parents do. And hoping to help bridge that gap for them a little bit. I don't speak Swahili or French, but the executive director of this organization speaks French because he was a refugee from the Congo. So we've got this rhythm of
Lovely
telephone
communication.
going, to try to get messages through. And so I was tasked with trying to start a dialogue with this teacher and try to see if we can get some additional help for this child. So I did talk with her. She, first of all, I don't think she is his regular teacher because she's like, I don't know who you're talking about. And she had to go find his file to kind of remind herself who we were talking about. And then I had mentioned that he had expressed that he had some issues with being teased in the classroom. If he raised his hand and gave a wrong answer, that he would get teased, and that he seemed to have issues with getting things done in the time allotted in class, and worksheets and things like that. So I was talking to her a little bit about that. I don't remember who brought up the B word, bullying. I don't remember if it was me or her. And then the principal was there. They were dealing with a child who had not received an award, and who was, and remember, these are 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, had not received an award and was very upset about it.
So 9 to 11 age group, typically in the
Yeah.
universities.
He was sad that he didn't get an award, and he was crying. And so
Mhm.
the white teacher, all of the teachers that I saw were white, and all of the students were black and brown. I did not see any white faces in the student body that I saw, the classes that I saw. And so the white teacher comes storming down the hallway, and she declares to the security guard that she needs to get back to class and she doesn't have time to deal with this. And he's down there crying. And Mr. So-and-so, you just need to deal with this. She throws it onto the security guard and she marches off to go back to her class. And I see the student come down the hallway, and he's, doing that sobbing kind of thing, when you've been crying for a little bit, and the security guard is barking at him. Why are you crying? Why are you crying? And I'm just like, I'm watching this all unfold, just cringing.
No
I just
care and consideration, just looks like a little mini
no care and
juvenile hall
consideration.
for the young
Just,
people.
yeah, just, and further humiliating him in the hallway. Why are you crying? Why are you crying? You don't need to be crying. There's nothing to be crying about, and he didn't say,
You don't
boys
even
don't
know this
cry, but he
child's
came
circumstance. You
close.
don't know if he's going to get in trouble when he gets home because he didn't get an award. You have no idea what the
No
circumstances.
idea. And
If
you
the
just
child
walk
is
out
coming
of an
from an African
awards.
background, there's like a very high standard of like what your educational
Yeah.
goals should be. So
Yeah. So the teacher wants to introduce me to the principal. So she takes me up, and finally the principal, finishes doing what she's doing, and she turns, and the teacher introduces her to me and says that I'm there to speak about this particular student. And I don't know if the principal knew who we were talking about, but the teacher said, he says he's being bullied. That's the first thing that she leads with. It's not the thing that I would have started out the gate with. I would have tried to relationship build with the principal and establish trust and, all of that. So the principal looks at the teacher and says, well, has he reported any bullying? And the teacher said, I don't think so. And the principal, still only talking to the teacher, hasn't really even looked at me except to say hello. Looking at the teacher and saying, well, if he hasn't reported anything, there's nothing we can do about it. And then she just kind of turned and basically dismissed us and walked away. And I was livid. I walked out of that school, and my first thought was all the things. It was just a completely messed up situation. That's not the language I used. And that, and you pointed out to me that actually it's operating exactly as it's supposed to, which you are so right. So that was the storytelling.
Some of my storytelling about the U.S. education. So for those who don't know, I do have 2 young people that went through U.S. education to a period of time. So by the time my first young person went through a number of different schools, like an international baccalaureate program, and then a Catholic education, and then kind of creative music art school and graduated and went on to university. My second young person followed in her sister's footsteps. However, getting to 8th grade, she was removed from the educational system completely and altogether by me. And that's just because the educational content was too harm. I watched the impact on my older daughter and her self-confidence and esteem be diminished by the way that education was happening. And then for me, education was really more of an experience of bringing forth and allowing young people's minds to be expanded rather than limited. And that's because I went to like very private institutions that just did education a little bit differently. Like I started out with at a Catholic school, but it was, you know, progressive Sacred Heart, Sisters of the Sacred Heart. So they had a very progressive, very feminist ideology and education. And then I went to an independent private school, blah, blah, blah. So my experience with the educational system was less limited, being able to compare my educational experience and also being a teacher in the classroom for a period of time and see, and in the South, like going from the West Coast and then the East Coast, which is super progressive, to then being in the classrooms in the South and seeing a clear and distinct difference between how young people are educated, and especially depending on what access and economic wealth you have in your different zip codes. And so what it sounds like is similar to what you were talking about. I recognize that in specific demographics and zip codes, the breeding ground of the educational experience is very representative of being imprisoned in some way, shape, or form. Just the time frames with which you're in class, the way that it's scheduled, the way that you experience lunchtime, the way that you experience passing through, going from classroom, going for outside experiences and coming back in. So if anybody hasn't been actually in a public school system in a long period of time, and then also the difference between East Coast, West Coast, and being in the South, you can see how it's breeding grounds for an enslaved ideology, a mindset where, like this man was talking about, you need to be smart to be able to navigate the system if you're existing in a system of white supremacy and capitalism. Absolutely. Right? So where are you going to be placed along that system? Are you going to be on the lower end of workers? Are you going to be in this middle position of a manager? And or are you going to be in a supervisory position in leadership and identifying what smart means in regards to the placement of that? Also knowing that there's an integration of criminalization, because if young people don't achieve awards or do well on any of the standardized testing, then they're already earmarked, especially in Black and Brown communities, to achieve a self, not achieve an opportunity to create or make a life. So the educational system for me is really a place that is institutionalizing minds and being very successful in creating an institutionalization of being a slave mentality. And I speak into that because last night I was at a event in a historically Black college and university where we were speaking into a campaign where we need more Black teachers and representative people, and also to have a different pedagogy that is being communicated in the schools to Black and Brown young people. So we need to be talking about futuring in the United States. We need to be talking about creating an open access. And we also need to be talking about education in a different way than the educational content that is coming through, especially under this new administration, which is trying to make sure that they regress back to the way education was shared before we had an evolution of including women's studies and Black studies and migrant people studies to actually be representative of like the melting pot of people that are here existing in the United States at this period of time.
Yeah. And I was, before we got on the recording here, we were talking about how that representation, I was in another group and we were talking about, and somebody said, you know, did you ever have any Black teachers or any teachers that didn't look like you? And I said, no, you know, all the way through. I mean, I'm not surprised that I didn't through my, you know, middle or elementary, middle and high school, because I went to
What's the reason that you're saying that you're...
Because I was in a segregated town at a private school where, you know, my graduating class was was 14 people. It was very small.
Mhm.
And so just given the town and the way the town is organized, it's still organized that way all these years later. That's why I
You had
was
a
saying that it
graduating
wasn't
class of like 14 people. You were like a small little Christian school.
it
What was
wasn't
that?
Christian, it wasn't faith-based.
For real?
It wasn't
Oh,
faith-based. We have 4
I thought I
girls.
went to an exclusive independent school. You
Yeah.
got 14 people. You were in a study.
It was, yeah, it was tiny. And I had been with my older sister and I, because she's 3 years older than me, when we first started in the school, it was just trailers. It was
Oh,
6
wow.
trailers, and the trailers were divided. They had like an accordion wall that went down the middle of it. So you would have one class, one grade on one side and one grade on the other. And they were in a circle, like,
Oh, interesting.
the Western settlers, would circle their wagons. It was that kind of configuration with the courtyard in the middle. And then I think when I was in 5th grade, they built what they called the upper school, which was the first like actual building. And now the school's gotten a lot bigger. My nephew actually graduated from there. My older sister's son, because they live in that town. He graduated from there a few years ago. And
So what
so,
was the educational philosophy at such a small little school in the South like that?
I mean, I wouldn't even begin to know what their philosophy was. It was definitely probably considered themselves to be a liberal arts kind of, education. I mean, it because the school was so small, it was very, you ran in your class pretty much. When we went to high school, we would have different classes, but it was still all the same people. I mean, I went
So you
from
went there from middle school all the way through high
No,
school.
2nd grade. I started in 2nd grade in that school and went all the way to graduation, and there were 6 of us that had been in the class together the entire
All the way
time.
to high school graduation.
6 out of 14, we had been together since 2nd grade.
So it's very cohort style education.
Yeah, and you couldn't reinvent yourself, and I was one of those kids that got bullied, so I was a hot mess until freshman year of high school. And then I started drinking, to be
And what were you
part of
getting bullied about in that type of
everything,
environment?
everything.
Because
I mean,
you came from a relatively affluent community. You're white. You have like blonde hair. You're a good looking lady. So what like kind of?
I was gangly. I was
Mm,
gangly. I didn't have, I mean, I have grown into myself in terms of my looks, my appearance. I was picked on there were 3 girls in the class that were, the top dogs. And it wasn't hard to be the top dog in a class that
Right.
small.
The
And you
two.
couldn't get away from anybody, and once you get labeled as the target, that target's on your back and then people would leave and new people would come in, and then they would get grabbed, by the popular
They would
kids and
find the
said,
other
"Oh,
culture.
we don't like her, so don't talk to her." And so it was just perpetual over and over. And I didn't have any self-confidence. I didn't have any self-esteem, and was just awkward. My Frugly stage lasted a lot longer than a lot of other kids did. And my older sister wasn't, she didn't really, we weren't friends until I got out of college. So she wasn't my champion. I didn't have her like
Community of
defending
supports.
me. Yeah, she didn't
Yeah.
care 2 shits about what was happening with me. So, and she was popular because she was blonde and she was all these things. And so I wasn't blonde then. This is enhanced. Um, so yeah, I mean, the bullying it was intense, and I didn't, until I started drinking and became the life of the party. I didn't, and I was bullied by my teachers too. I mean, I was telling this young person that I am mentoring, when he was talking about getting picked on by the students, I said, I had that experience, but it was my teacher.
Yeah.
It was 7th or 8th grade, which is awkward as hell anyway, right? And we're in math class and we were working on long division, and he wanted us to keep a lot of the numbers in our heads. He didn't want us to do, sometimes when you're doing long division with lots of numbers in the problem,
Numbers.
that
Absolutely.
it could be really
Gotta
long
be
before
written
you're
down.
done with it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
He wanted us to keep a lot of those numbers in our heads and not write absolutely everything out. Well, I couldn't do that. I had dyslexia. I would flip things around. I couldn't do that. I had to write everything down. So I was doing it the only way I knew how to do it to get successfully to the answer. And he was walking around the classroom and looking over everybody's shoulder. And he came up to me and he looked at what I was doing and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm doing long division." I said, "I can't keep the numbers in my head. I have to write them down." And he's like, "What are you, stupid?" In front of the whole class, which I already was labeled as the stupid kid and I was a B and C student. And so, yeah, yes, I had lots of privilege, but in that microcosm, in that community, in that ecosystem, I was at the bottom of the heap. So
Yeah.
so I know what it feels like.
I'm thinking about like the individual bullying and like the systemic bullying and like what that experience feels like to consistently, to your point of the gentleman who got up in front of the auditorium of people and said, "Don't be stupid," right? Like this kind of admonition of, you are stupid if you present from this space and place or positioning in society. And it's unfortunate that when education, which is supposed to bring forth the knowledge that is already existing within and kind of expand it so that then we can evolve and create a little bit further, but then to see that our educational institutions are so limiting and want people just to like kind of tool the line, get used to sitting for long periods of time, get used to having information fed into you and regurgitating the information. And that is the thing that qualifies your positioning, that they do not encourage you to be imaginative or to go outside and think outside of the box.
I mean, they tease you with it. They, don't you want to be creative? But then the moment you are,
you can't. It doesn't creative within the context of what will make the machine operate more effectively. That's what I understand the definition of creativity is, but not creativity where you're thinking outside of the box or asking yourself how you can do something differently and create different outcomes and greater impact for a different group of people. Those are where the challenge to the educational institutionalization happens, which is why I said, let me take my young person out and see what happens. To that point, there is something that's important about socializing people to be able, in this day and age, to be able to communicate with each other when you do have the option of only communicating through technology. And if we're not figuring out ways within our educational institutions to be able to be in community with each other, then there is a different level of harm that we are also creating. Because I am thinking about the young person that I did take out of school, and then what it looks like for her to be developing social relationships and working in teams with other people becomes like much more difficult, which is something to be thinking about, depending on how it is that we want our future to look.
Yeah. It's funny you talk about creativity, because I was just telling somebody yesterday, I mean, I'm an artist now, but I didn't start painting until like 9 years ago. I never thought I could be creative. I always used to say that I could make a stick figure look good, and when I was going through undergrad, because I got my degree in special ed, when we were charged with doing the bulletin board designs, oh my God, I was so stressed because I just couldn't come up with anything new, couldn't come up with anything. When you said that, it made me think of that. It's like, I wonder if that lack of creativity has a lot to do with what I grew up in, that I wasn't allowed. I wasn't, it wasn't a space that was safe for me to be creative, because I was just trying to survive the day to day. Even with all the privilege that I had, I didn't have any privilege or didn't have the perception of having any privilege in the boundaries of that school, in that classroom. Yeah, it was just to keep my head above water and get through every day. So
what would it look like to imagine an educational system differently than the one that we have existing in the United States at this moment?
Well, I think there are some models out there.
Which one?
Montessori is,
I love Montessori. That's what my ladies were in. When
it's
they were
not so much the American version of Montessori, though. I mean, the true Maria Montessori version. Yeah. Because the USians, we've watered it down quite a bit. my
Well,
daughter went
we
to,
are culture things, I think, a little differently.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
My daughter went to was in Montessori from age 3
Mhm.
to through third grade, what they would
Oh,
consider
okay, wow.
third grade.
Mhm.
And because I knew, I mean, she showed the ability to know things very, very early on. And I was like, and her age, because of the cutoffs that they have around birthdays and when you can start certain grades and things like that, I knew they were going to hold her back because of her when her birthday landed, and because she had a fall birthday.
Mhm.
And I was like, she's going to be bored to tears and get into nothing but, mischief, because she was identifying and reading and doing things way earlier
Mhm.
than,
Mhm.
so
It's
that's why I looked for a Montessori placement for her that I felt like she could expand in. And they didn't use grades. They didn't use, and a
yeah,
lot of the teachers fussed about it. I mean, a lot of the parents fussed about it. And I remember having conversations with the parents going, but
that's not the point. It's
didn't you put your
Montessori.
child in Montessori because you didn't
Or
want, but,
Montessori.
but they would be drawn back their own
Mm,
conditioning into having grades that showed prowess, the award. I would see parents struggling with that, their own conditioning of,
mm.
I need to have that grade to know that I'm worthy. Even if they put their child in Montessori intentionally, they still had to fight that pattern,
Yeah,
that program
ideology,
that
that
was
personality.
programmed in them very early on.
Mhm.
But I was glad that she didn't go to typical school
Mhm.
until, more traditional school, until fourth grade. And I was really glad that she didn't have grades up until that point, because she struggled with, I want the grade, I want the grade, I want the
Right.
grade. Um,
All the young people get into that.
right. But it was easier for me to help her understand that it wasn't just about the grade, it was how you got there, because she
Mhm.
had been in a grade less environment for so many years. It really
Mhm.
helped me balance that. If she'd been in a typical education system, the whole time, where
Would have
grades
been more
were the
programs.
carrot,
Yep.
I think it would have been harder for her to
Mhm.
manage that. But I ended up putting her at a school, ironically enough, that was almost exactly like the one that I went to in terms
Mhm.
of its size. And
Mhm.
it's, I wanted that for her. We were in South Carolina. The public school system there is crap. And I wanted her to have a little bit better. But I mean, when I went for the tour, I walked into the gym and it smelled the same. It
Mm.
looked the same. It felt the same as the experience that I had. And there was a part of me that was like, I don't want to do that to her, because she
Mm.
struggled with the same thing I did. She was bullied. She never
Okay.
could reinvent herself. New students would come in and she would maybe get a whisper of maybe she could make a friend. And then, the kids that had already labeled her as X, Y, and Z, she struggled with her weight. So
Yeah.
that was the end that they had for bullying her. And even when she lost weight when she was 16, they still treated her like she was the heaviest kid in the class, and
Mhm.
bullied her about it. So,
Mm.
it's
Definitely,
funny
yeah.
that I ended up recreating that experience for her in choosing to do that instead of putting her into a larger school environment, which might have been a better fit for her. I don't know, but it
Yeah,
is.
we never know. I mean, parenting is a hard thing to figure out, but what's important is to be able to reflect on those things and then also try to support your young people in whatever educational experience they've had, to recognize that it is the wealth of information that you are receiving, gaining, so that you can figure out how to navigate your way through we're experiencing as a chaotic world. And I'll even
Yeah,
say, as somebody who came through the educational system at a completely different time than what young people are experiencing now,
right.
I really appreciate and give young people credit for navigating and challenging the content, because they have such a wealth of information that they can use. And I think
Please challenge the content.
no,
Dear God, please. And
no,
for
yeah,
any parents listening out there, encourage your children to challenge the content.
absolutely.
Um,
And it
you
makes
know,
it more fun to be able to be in, in those environments and in those institutions, when you can ask questions and be curious and expand the thought process. And
Well, I know it's hard because they keep changing, like, the math.
all
You know,
all the
even with
time.
my daughter's 28 now, but even when she was in school, I didn't know how to help her with the math because it wasn't math that I had ever done. So
Mhm.
I was like, I don't even know I don't even know how to help you, you know? And so it makes it
Yes.
really challenging and very
Learning is continuous, for
yeah,
sure.
it is.
Challenging and continuous and worth
It
every
is.
moment, the
It
way every moment.
is. So, and ironically enough, he didn't even mention education during the State of the Union
At all, at all. And so it's
'cause it's
important to
working
have
exactly the way he wants it
because
to
that
right
is
now.
the future of the US and the way that they want to be educating. And the reason why they even established the institution of education is to create more workers that could do the jobs that were necessary to be done during the Industrial Revolution. So we have to remember that the education in the United States was created for a particular means, and they're actually rolling back some legislation that would protect the rights and the lives of young people, which children's rights came into effect because so many young people were working in the industry for less wages and in more dangerous situations because their smaller bodies could get into places in the machines that
Right.
adult bodies could not get into. And so as people started to campaign against the violence and the terror that was happening to the young people, and when I say violence and terror, I'm not just talking about management of them and their time and lack of food, but I'm talking about fingers were getting chopped off, legs were getting chopped off. There was like all kinds of environmental um, uh,
Hazards.
hazards for young people and young people's lives. So that's where a lot of the children's rights were developed. And in the State of the Union address, they weren't talking so much about education, but they were talking about rolling back legislations that protect young people so that more young people could enter into the workforce and work system because they are really returning to a system of slavery where
Yeah.
more people are going to be utilized as workers,
Yeah.
as a resource within industry.
So we have to stay awake.
As a big exhale and a big sigh. That's it. In regards to what we give AF about education in the
We do
United
give
States.
a fuck about
We don't hear
education.
it in the
Everybody
States
should
of
give a fuck
February.
about it. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for the
Thank you.
conversation.
Thank you.
Why do I give a fuck? Why do
Thanks
I
for
give
joining
a
us.
fuck?
Until next time,
Why
as you
do I
move
try
throughout
so
your day,
hard?
continue to ask yourself,
Why do I give a
Why Do I Give a Fuck is produced in collaboration with Johanna and Diane. Music by Norwegian musician Water. See you next time.